The first time James saw Carl, he was framed by the cracked windows of the old iron depot like a sleek blade set against weathered wood. Carl stood at the front of the council chamber in a charcoal suit, a digital rendering of glass and steel rising behind him on the projector screen. His voice was low, practiced, and just self-assured enough to make James's jaw clench. "Progress," Carl said, hands clasped. "Doesn't ask permission from nostalgia." A murmur swept the room. James felt the old floorboards reverberate. Under his boots, he'd grown up with the depot as backdrop, the scent of creosote and coffee from the diner across the tracks stitched into his childhood. When he rose to speak, he kept his tone even, but his pulse thudded hot. "Progress doesn't need to erase our past to make room for the future," James said. "You're proposing to replace history with a mirror. What do we see in it then except ourselves and how shiny we think we are?" Someone in the back, Mrs. Hargreaves, who'd taught James to read, snorted a laugh. Carl's mouth tilted into a sharp, not-quite smile, like he'd been waiting for this. Blue eyes flicked over James's flannel shirt, the rolled sleeves, the ink stain on his fingers. It was an assessment, a sorting, and it stung more than James expected. "Reusing the depot," Carl replied smoothly, "would cost more than this city can responsibly spend. Sentiment is not a budget line." "Neither is arrogance," James said, and the room made that hungry sound crowds make when they sense a fight. The council chairwoman cleared her throat, weary and amused. "Gentlemen, please. Mr. Voss, Mr. Carr." James felt the words prickle under his skin. Carl Voss, architect darling, magazine spreads, interviews where he talked about light and space as if they were his to command. He was beautiful in the way of expensive things, clean lines, crisp hair, a pocket square like a folded secret. James hated noticing it. When the rain started, it came hard, rattling the windows. A bulb fizzed overhead. The chairwoman sighed and banged the gavel. "We'll break, then reconvene," she said. "No one leave town. We're not kicking this down the tracks. Mr. Carr, Mr. Voss, stay a moment." James packed his notes slowly, as if delay could thicken the air between them. Carl lingered by the projector, scrolling through slides with a flick of his thumb. He had hands a person could imagine drawing lines through air and making buildings stand up. "Mr. Carr," Carl said without looking over, "do you practice your barbs in the mirror, or are you naturally gifted?" James shouldered his messenger bag. "I don't have your experience with mirrors." Carl's eyes finally met his. Up close, they were the color of winter sky over the river, a clear, hard blue that made James acutely aware of rain damp on his neck. A beat passed that felt like a dare. The chairwoman reappeared with the city planner, both of them damp at the edges. "Here's where we are," she said. "We can't afford a full restoration. We also can't afford to set half the town on fire by demoing the depot. The grant committee called this afternoon. If we propose an adaptive reuse plan within 60 days, we remain eligible for state funds. That means a hybrid approach." Carl's posture didn't change. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning you," she said, pointing at Carl. "And you," pointing now at James, "are going to come back in 2 weeks with a concept that preserves the facade and key elements of the depot while allowing for a modern core. We'll open it for public comment, then submit preliminary designs along with a grant application. Congratulations, you're collaborators." James's laugh came out more brittle than he meant. "You want me to help salvage a project I opposed?" "I want to save a piece of this city and not go bankrupt," the chairwoman said. "And I want 2 people who can keep each other honest. Can you manage that?" Carl's gaze slid to James, assessing again. But there was something else now, a flicker of interest that had nothing to do with budgets. "I can work with anyone," he said. James thought of his father teaching him to sand an old banister, until it gleamed of the depot at sunset, windows catching gold like held breath. He thought, against his will, of Carl's steady, measured voice and the way irritation had looked almost handsome on his face. 2 weeks, James said. Fine. They stepped into the hallway together. The storm had darkened the stairwell, making the emergency lights glow a rude orange. For a moment, in the dimness, the two of them were just shapes and breath and the sharp scent of wet wool. Carl adjusted his cuff like a nervous tick, and James hated that the motion drew his attention to the narrow tendon of his wrist. "This is not personal," Carl said quietly. "It feels personal when you call my work nostalgia," James replied. Carl's mouth softened. "Then I'll try to choose better words." A drop fell from the ceiling onto the back of James's hand. He looked up. A seam in the plaster had split, water beating along it like a string of pearls. There was a small, ridiculous intimacy in standing together under a leak. "You free tomorrow?" Carl asked, and the question sounded like more than logistics. 9 a.m. at the depot? James nodded because if he spoke, he might say something unhelpful, like yes, more than I should be. 9, he managed. "Don't be late." Carl's smile was brief, uneven. "I'm never late." "Good," James said, though his heartbeat had inexplicably sped up. "Neither am I." The rails behind the old iron depot wore a skin of dew that turned the morning light to mercury. James got there early, because he always did, because the building felt easier to face when it was empty and the shadows hadn't chosen sides yet. He unlocked the side door and stepped into cool air that smelled like old iron and wet wood. Dust motes lifted at his arrival, surprised into flight. He walked the platform the way you check a pulse, palm on posts, eye on seams. Here, a hairline crack in a brick. There, the original ticket window, brass grill dulled to the color of old coins. The great clock face still hung above the concourse like a moon that had forgotten how to keep time. James set his bag down and pulled out a tape measure. Chalk line. Pencil. He drew a cross on the concrete to mark something only he could see. "You're early," Carl said behind him. James didn't startle, which felt like a small victory. "You said 9. "It is 9. Today, Carl wore dark jeans and a black sweater under a waxed jacket, boots clean but not city shiny. He looked less like a magazine spread and more like someone who might actually use a hammer, which James resented as an effective disguise. "I don't like wasting light, James," said Carl's mouth tipped. "No, you like controlling it." "Guilty," James replied, then realized he'd said it in the exact tone Carl had used last night. He turned away and pointed up. "Clear story windows, original glass in 3. If we can salvage the frames—" "We will," Carl said, following his gaze. "The mullions are warped, but that can be braced. I'd backpaint a low-iron panel for the missing panes to keep the rhythm without faking age." James glanced sideways. "Backpaint, not frosted?" "Frosted. Lies," Carl said. "Backpaint admits it's new." The word admits landed softly. They moved together through the space, their footfalls setting pigeons clattering from a beam like a shaken deck of cards. Carl took photos with methodical patience, framing corners and joints, sometimes stepping back, sometimes lowering to eye. Level with a sill as if the building were a person whose face he was trying to read. "About last night," Carl said, and the echo gave the words more weight than they might have had outdoors. "I was sloppy with nostalgia. I meant sentimentality." "Which is different." "I heard idiot," James said, not because he wanted to, but because honesty had been demanded of both of them, and he didn't know how to do it halfway. Carl's camera lowered. "I don't think you're an idiot." "Good," James said, then added because the truth liked balance. "I don't think you're a machine." Something eased in Carl's shoulders, like a knot in a rope when you stop pulling from both ends. They went up to the mezzanine by a narrow staircase that creaked like a complaint lodged years too late. The boards up there were thin, patched, with plywood. James tested each step before moving his full weight. He reached for a rafter to steady himself, the wood cool and a little damp. A plank shifted under his boot, tilted just enough to turn his stomach over. His hand slipped, heel scraping, a quick, embarrassing skid toward empty air. Warmth closed around his forearm, firm and precise. Carl's other hand pressed hard at James's hip, anchoring him to the beam. For a breath, they were a single problem, solving itself. James could feel the beat of Carl's pulse through shirts and skin, quick and steady, a metronome he hadn't known he was playing to. "Got you," Carl said quietly. "I'm fine," James replied, and knew by the rasp in his voice that he was a terrible liar. They stayed like that a second too long, then stepped apart with identical, awkward efficiency. "Mezzanine is a structural liability," Carl said, a fraction too brisk. "We can rebuild it as a suspended walkway along the north wall. Steel. Stringers, open grating so the original trusses still red. And keep the old stair?" James asked. "As a sculptural element," Carl said, then when James's mouth flattened, "and a second egress after reinforcement, if the engineer blesses it." "Compromise," James said, and meant it like a new word he was still learning to pronounce. They mapped the space with chalk and gestures. James talked about a market hall that could turn the depot into a daily use, not just a spectacle. Artisans, a bakery, the smell of yeast in the morning, a small archive room where kids could listen to old conductors' stories, headphones too, big for their heads. Carl countered with a clean-lined core tucked behind the brick facade, galleries and flexible event space to pay the bills, glass that wouldn't apologize for being born yesterday. "What if," Carl said, crouching too. "Sketch on the concrete, we make the connection, the seam visible? 2 lines, one old, one new, meeting at an honest joint. A glazed atrium between brick and core. We don't pretend they're the same era. We let the light do the work of introducing them." James knelt beside him, the chalk dusting his fingers, pale. "The seam," he repeated, and saw it. A place where you could stand and look left into history and right into what comes next. He nodded. "That could sing." Carl reached into his satchel and produced 2 coffees, still hot. "Peace offering," he said. "I didn't know how you take it." "Black," James said, taking the cup. Their fingers didn't touch, which somehow made the not touching louder. He sipped. "It's good." "Architects live on caffeine and hubris," Carl said. "I'm trying to cut back on one of those." James, despite himself, smiled. "How's that going?" Carl's eyes flicked to his, then away. "Badly." They sat on the platform steps, boot heels ringing faintly on iron. Outside, a freight train howled somewhere miles off, the sound arriving like a ghost remembering the way. They traded tasks like cards. Carl would get his structural engineer out this week. James would meet the Historical Society to beg, borrow, and scan every photo of the depot from 1890 onward. They'd reconvene Wednesday to build a narrative for the grant that wasn't just numbers, but light and people and use. When they exchanged numbers, James typed Carl Voss and impulsively snapped a photo to attach to the contact card. Carl. In profile, looking up at the clock, morning pouring over his cheekbones like a verdict. For the grant file, James told himself. For later reference. For something. "Tomorrow?" Carl asked, as if the time between now and then were a room he wanted to cross quickly. 9, James said, standing. He felt steadier than when he'd arrived, and less certain about everything else. "Don't be late." Carl's smile was a brief flare, like sun caught on glass. "I'm never late." James watched him go, felt the depot settle around him, with a long old breath, and thought, annoyed and a little exhilarated, that the future he wanted might already have both their fingerprints on it. The Historical Society lived in the library's basement, where the air held a polite hush and the shelves wore little labels that sounded like apologies. Ephemera, miscellany, undated. James arrived early with a tray of cinnamon rolls from Marron's and a promise to be careful. Mrs. Hargreaves presided in a cardigan the color of oatmeal and the authority of a woman who remembered everyone's middle name and first lie. Carl slipped in 2 minutes before 9, hair damp from the drizzle, a paper bag of pastries in his hand like he'd intuited the ritual. He greeted Mrs. Hargreaves with the same seriousness he gave investors in suits, and when she handed him a pair of cotton gloves, he put them on without being told. "This is 1903, she said, sliding out a photograph. The depot in its first year, flags giddy on the facade. And this, another, later, actresses crossing the concourse on their way to the lyric 1927. Carl bent over the images as if they contained instructions the future couldn't do without. "Where did the light come from?" he asked. "Midday. The clear story. Do you remember how it moved?" Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. "I remember everything," she said. At 5 in winter, it made the benches look like they were on fire. James watched Carl translate what he heard into lines in his head, into possible objects. It wasn't performance. He asked about the ticket window. "Do you still have the grill?" About the original clock. "Who wound it? When did it stop?" He didn't touch the photos' faces with his fingers, only his eyes. After, back at the depot, the engineer arrived. Meera Patel, hair in a tight coil, boots that meant business. A clipboard like an extra spine. She shook their hands and made her way across the floor with a dancer's caution, tapping beams, squinting up at joints. She measured, listened, conferred with a laser level like it could whisper secrets if you knew how to ask. 3 issues, she said when they gathered under the clock face like parishioners. 1, moisture intrusion at the south foundation, fixable with drains. 2, the mezzanine, replace it if you want people to keep their ankles. 3, the big one, and she tipped her chin at the clock. The central truss is bearing more weight than it should. This bracket, she tapped the iron arm with her pen, was overbuilt for its era, but the wood behind it isn't. You keep 800 pounds of cast iron and bell up there, someday it comes down on someone's head. My recommendation, remove the clock from the truss. The words landed heavy. James felt heat rise under his collar. Remove it to where? A museum case? Meera was kind. Or you build new structure to hold it. But it cannot stay where it is as is. It isn't safe. Carl's jaw worked once. We can't endanger people to save a detail, he said. The air in his voice clipped, like he was strangling something gentler. It's not a detail, James snapped. It's the heart. Meera's eyes flicked between them, professional neutrality filmed over concern. I'll send the report tonight, she said, and excused herself. The silence left behind had corners. James walked away because he didn't trust what he might say next. Boot steps loud on the platform. He stopped under the eaves, rain-making, a beaded curtain beyond. The tracks gleamed like long thoughts. Carl followed, stopping an arm's length away. I know what the clock means, he said, careful. I heard it in that room downstairs. I can't sign off on a plan that risks someone's skull. That's not arrogance. That's not wanting to be the person who misses what the beam is telling him. James stared at the rain. You're ready to put it in a case? No. Carl's voice softened. I'm saying we need to admit the truth publicly and then do something better because of it. James let out a laugh that sounded broken. Frosted lies, remember? We don't fake age. We also don't fake courage, Carl said. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, a nervous sweep James recognized now as a tell. When I was a kid, we moved. My dad's job, city to city. Every place had a different clock over a different concourse, and it was the only thing that felt like a rule. You could look up and think, as long as time is happening, I know where I am. He swallowed. Then my mom left, and for a year every clock was an accusation. I spent a lot of time wanting to control what it does. This, he nodded toward the iron face. I want it to look us in the eye and be honest. We're new here. We're holding you now. You're safe. James turned. The story had arrived without pity, simply laid there like a blueprint for why a beam carried what it did. Something in him rearranged around it. What do you have in mind? He asked, and it didn't come out as a dare this time. Carl's hands began to draw the air. We take the clock down with ceremony. We preserve the bracket and leave its shadow, an inlay on the wall that shows where it was. Then we fabricate a new steel halo in the glazed seam, our atrium, and suspend the clock there. It floats between old and new, literally in the line that admits both. We run a new mechanism, retrain the chime. First thing you see when you enter is time held up by what we built to meet it. James pictured it, the circle hanging like a kept promise, light sliding through it at 5 in winter, benches looking on fire. His anger didn't vanish, but it melted at the edges, revealed something else under it. Relief, maybe, that someone was willing to carry this with him without pretending. It was easy, he exhaled. You care more than you let people see, he said. Carl's smile was small, pained. I'm practicing admitting that. A drop found the edge of Carl's jaw and paused there like a decision. James, without planning to, reached up and thumbed away a streak of chalk he hadn't realized he'd left on Carl's cheek earlier. His hand hovered a second, heat skimming the cool of rain. Carl didn't move. James, he said, and his voice gave the name back to James like an answer. The kiss, when it happened, wasn't cinematic. It was careful, almost practical, and the experiment in loads and balances. How little pressure accomplishes this? How much truth can a mouth carry? It still did something to James's chest that felt like a wall being opened to light. They stepped back at the same time, the world resuming its frames. The rain had eased to a sound like breath through long grass. Okay, James said, and it was admission and agreement and a promise to try. Let's show Mira how we hold a heart without dropping it. Carl nodded, eyes bright with relief and something that made James want to step in again. 9 tomorrow? Don't be late, James said, and for once he didn't mean the hour. The morning of the ceremony came on bright and cool, the kind of blue that made the depot's brick look freshly scrubbed. James was there at first light, running a palm over the new halo bracket gleaming in the seam where glass met brick. The steel ring waited like a promise. Carl arrived with coffee and that quiet focus he wore when the room mattered, hair pushed back by the wind, mouth set but not hard. Never late, he said. Good, James answered. Me neither. By 10, the place was full. Mrs. Hargreaves shepherded a swarm of children in paper conductor hats. The chairwoman stood near the dais with a stack of comments cards. Someone from the paper hovered by the chalk line where the old met the new. Mira directed a crew with calm authority, rigging the iron clock with slings and a hoist, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a second hand on the dial. The bracket's shadow still showed where time had hung too long. James found Carl's shoulder with his own, a touch that felt both public and secret. Ready? Carl's answering glance was a small, private smile. We admit what we are, he said, voice low. Then we make it beautiful. They spoke before the lift. James began, hands open, telling a story about benches set on fire by winter light, about the smell of yeast that might fill mornings here if they got this right. He said the word heart and didn't apologize for it. Carl followed and didn't hide behind jargon. We won't fake age, he said. We'll honor it, and we won't hide what's new. We'll show the seam where the two meet. That's where the light lives. Mira gave a nod. The crew tightened lines. The clock shifted, a breath taken for the first time in a century. Metal sang softly against metal. Dust drifted down in a glittering sigh. the hoist whirred. For a second, the iron face hesitated, like a thing unsure it deserved to be held. A sling creaked. One of the guide ropes slipped a fraction through a gloved hand. The clock yawed, not far, but enough to tilt a gut. A collective intake of breath rose from the room like a wave. James was already moving, one step onto the scaffold, wait and reach, and learned balance. He took the rope, hip braced to the rail. Carl planted himself at his back, palm firm between James's shoulder blades, the kind of touch that translated fear into math. Force here, counter there. "Got you," Carl said, and the words steadied the line as much as the hand. Mira's voice cut cleanly through. "Hold, correct, slow." The crew adjusted. The tilt answered. The clock eased back into true. They lowered it to the floor first, because respect sometimes looks like letting something touch ground. Mrs. Hargreaves, eyes bright, put her hand on the iron for a second like a blessing. Then the lift began again, this time toward the halo. The ring caught the light and made it into something James could feel on his skin. The clock rose through the seam, between brick and glass, and when it cleared the new steel brace and settled, suspended, honest, the entire room exhaled. 5 past noon wasn't winter, but the sun found an angle anyway. It poured through the clear story and set the benches alight. The iron face reflected a soft blaze across the floor. James heard a child say, "It's floating," in a voice that believed in miracles that were also engineering. They'd retrained the mechanism. On cue, a single careful chime sounded through the depot. Clear, not too loud, a note you could put your back against and trust. It seemed to ring through James's chest and out through Carl's hand, still warm at his spine. The meeting that followed felt almost easy by comparison. They wheeled out boards and renderings, told the story the way they'd lived it. The seam, the market hall, the galleries that would keep the lights on, the halo holding time. Questions came about cost, about parking, about whether this was too much new or too much old. The chairwoman rolled a pen between her fingers and watched them as if measuring how they stood when tested. Carl didn't deflect when someone pressed about budgets. "We pared back," he said. "We also chose where to spend. On the seam, on the halo, on the parts that tell the truth." James added, "And on drains, so the south wall stops pretending it's a river." Laughter loosened the room. When the vote came, it wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. "We submit the grant with this concept," the chairwoman said, signing, "and we proceed to schematic design. Don't be late on your deadlines." Outside, dusk leaned in. The depots. New glass turned evening to honey. James and Carl slipped away to the seam, where the clock hung like a kept promise, and the ring threw a clean arc of shadow across brick. The room had emptied to the sound of the building rediscovering its own breath. "So," Carl said, hands in his pockets, looking up, "we held the heart." "We," James echoed, savoring the plural. He turned to find Carl already looking at him. "I don't want to do this part alone anymore," he said. "The work, the other bit." Carl's laugh was soft, a release, more than a sound. "I was trying to think of something eloquent about load paths and trust." He shook his head. "I'm in love with you. It feels like admitting a seam I hoped was there." James stepped close, enough that the clock's shadow edged across both their chests. "Then we don't pretend it isn't. We let the light do the introducing." He touched Carl's jaw, familiar now with the fine muscle that jumped when he was bracing against tenderness. "Don't be late," he said, and it wasn't about schedules. "I won't," Carl said. "Not for this." The clock marked the next minute, a small click-like agreement. They kissed under the halo, the kind of careful that knew exactly how much weight a span could bear and still chose to cross together. Outside, the rails kept their silver. Inside, time hung where it could see them, and the seam held. If James and Carl's journey moved you, subscribe, like, comment, and share too. Keep the seam and their story alive.